Hi everyone, Ravi this side. Welcome to Engineering Adda. Today in this video, we are going to discuss about the HTTP status codes. So we are going to see what is HTTP status codes, what are the different type of HTTP status code, and we'll practically try to use this HTTP status code in our Spring Boot application. So we'll go through this concept first, and then practically we'll create one Spring Boot application, and there we'll try to practically use this status codes. So let me try to go to the next slide and discuss about the introduction of HTTP status codes. So first of all, what is HTTP status code? Before that, you need to know what is HTTP means. So HTTP stands for the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It is the foundation of the data communication on www, or you can say World Wide Web. So HTTP stands for the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which is a protocol, and it is the foundation of the data transfer on the World Wide Web, or you can say Internet. Now, HTTP status codes are the 3-digit numbers returned by a web server in response to a client request. So let's say you have developed one application, and that application is going to be consumed by some client. Okay, in that application you have developed couple of APIs, and the client is going to hit those APIs in order to retrieve the information. Now when the client will hit those API, it will get a response. Okay, and the response could be anything that you are returning on those APIs. But along with the responses, the response also contains the HTTP codes, which is the 3-digit codes. And according to the responses, those codes are designed. Let's say you get the successful response, or the client get the successful response. For that, there is a different HTTP status code, which belongs to the Code1xx family. If the client is not able to hit those API, the API is not available, then the client will get different status code that belong to the 400 family. So this is what HTTP status code is. It is a 3-digit number returned by a web server in response to the client request. These codes provide information about the status of the request and help in troubleshooting the issue. So let's say if we are not returning the correct HTTP codes in a response, then we will not able to troubleshoot the issues. So it is very much important to learn about this HTTP status code and use it in a very efficient and effective way to troubleshoot your issues. Okay, so this is the introduction of HTTP status code. Now let me try to go to the next slide and discuss about the categories of HTTP status code. So this HTTP status code are categorized in 5 classes. The first one is informational class, second is successful class, third is redirectional class, the fourth one is client error class, and the fifth one is server error class. Okay, or you can say that these all 5 classes return the following responses. Like the first class, which is 1xx, that means 100, 101, 104, 103. There are different status code in that particular class, and that 1xx class is also called as informational class, or informational responses is returns. Similarly, we have 2xx class, which returns the successful responses. We have 3xx class, which return the redirectional messages. We have 4xx class, which return the client error responses. We have 5xx class, which return the server error responses. So these are the 5 categories of HTTP status code that are present as of now, and that is what we are going to discuss and read out in this video. And practically we'll also try to see those things as well. Now let me try to go to the next slide and discuss about the first category of the HTTP status code, which is informational responses, which is 1xx. These status codes indicate that the server has received the request and is continuing the process. So let's say you have developed one API and client is going to hit that API, and server got those responses from the client, server got the client request, but is still processing the request and it is taking more time, then in that case, it gives you this continuation or continuing messages. And in that case, we are going to use the 100 HTTP status code. Similarly, for switching protocol, we have 101. This is about the first category of the HTTP status code, which is informational category or informational responses category, or you can say 1xx. Now let me try to go to the next slide and discuss about the 100 where we can use it. Okay, the client should continue with its request. This interim response is used to inform the client that the initial part of the request has been received and has not been rejected by the server. The client should continue by sending the reminder of the request, or if the request has already been completed, ignore this response. The server must send a final response after the request has been completed. So this is what the 100 HTTP status code do. When we are going to use the 100, that means, let's say we have one API and the client is going to hit that API. The request hit by the client has reached the server and the server is processing on that request, and it is taking much time for the server to return the response. In that case, you have to return the continue, or you have to return the 100 HTTP status code in that API to the client. So this is about the 100 HTTP status code. Now let me try to go to the next slide and discuss about the 2xx group of HTTP status code, which is successful responses. Now these status codes indicate that the request was received, understood, and accepted successfully. So let's say I will again bring you the same example. Let's say you have developed an application. In that application, you have developed an API, and that client is going to use that API. Client is going to hit that API, and let's say the client hit that API. Now when the client hit that API, that request goes to the server and it was received by the server, it was understood by the server, it was accepted by the server, and then it returns some responses to the client. In that case, that is called successful responses, and that category belong to the 2xx. So let's say client has raised a request, or client has used one API and it has received the response. In that case, you have to use this 2xx HTTP status codes. Let me try to discuss about this 200, 201 and 204 HTTP status code in brief. So let's say you have developed one GET API and client hit that and client get the response. In that case, you have to use 200 HTTP status code, which is OK status code. Let's say client has developed, you have developed put and post API and client hit that put and post API. In that case, client got the response. In that case, you have to use this 201, which is created HTTP status code. Now let me try to give you the example of 204, which is no content. So let's say you have developed one delete API, and you are using that delete API to only delete the record from the DB, and you are not returning anything to the client as a response. Then in that case, you should use 204 HTTP status code for that API. So these are the various example of 2xx HTTP status code, like 200, 201, 204. Now let me try to go to the next slide and discuss about the 200 HTTP status code. So the 200 HTTP status code, this is the most general status code, most common code used to indicate the success. Okay, so this is the general success status code, you can say. Standard responses for successful HTTP request. The actual response will depend upon the request method used. In a GET request, the response will contain an entity corresponding to the request resource. In a POST request, the response will contain an entity describing or containing the result of the action. So this 200 HTTP status code can be used in the GET or in the POST, and it is mainly used for the indicating the success of that particular response. Okay, so this is about the 200. Now let me try to go to the next slide and discuss about the 201. So this 201 is also known as created, right? So basically it is used for the put and post APIs, where you make the changes. So in the put API or in the post API, you basically what you do, you will try to create something new in the DB, right? So there this 201 HTTP status code is being used. The request has been fulfilled and resulted in a new resource being created. Okay, the newly created resource can be referenced by the URI returned in the entity of the response, with the most specific URI for the resource given by the location header field. The response should include an entity containing the list of the resource characteristics and location from which the user or the user agent can choose the one most appropriate. Okay, so this is basically used for the put and post API, where the resources is being created, you can say. Okay, now let me try to go to the next slide and discuss about the 204. So if you'll go back, you can see that this 204 is for the no content, and I told you about the example of the 204 where we can use it. So basically this is also a successful response, but in the response of that particular request, the server does not return anything in the response, like it is not going to return any entity or anything. So basically this is used for the delete API. So let's say you have created one delete API where you are basically deleting the things from the database and you are not returning anything. So there you can use this 204. The server has fulfilled the request but does not need to return any entity body and might want to return updated meta information. The response may include new or updated meta information in the form of entity headers, which if present should be associated with the requested variant. So this is basically used for that purpose. Now let me try to go to the next slide and discuss about the 3xx family of HTTP status code, which is redirection messages. So these status codes indicate that the further action needs to be taken by the client to complete the request. Okay, so this is basically the redirectional status code, you can say. These status codes indicate that the further action needs to be taken by the client to complete the request. Okay, here are the example of redirectional HTTP status code, like 301, which is moved permanently, 302, which is found, previously it was moved, and 304, which is not modified. Now one by one I am going to discuss this important HTTP status code coming from 3xx family, and let me try to go to the next slide. So here we are picking the 301 first. So status code is 301 and status name is moved permanently. Now in the description you can see that the requested resource has been permanently moved to the new URL. So when the client is getting this 301 HTTP status code, it means that the requested resource by the client has been permanently moved to a new URL. Client should update its bookmark or link to point to the new URL provided in the response. Okay, when a client receives 301 status code, it should automatically redirect to the new URL specified in the response. This helps ensure that the user are redirected to the correct location of the resource, even if they are using an outdated URL. So this is what 301 means. It means that the current URL is moved permanently to the new URL. Okay, and user is able to get those things in the response. The new URL is being displayed to the user in the response. Now let me try to go to the next slide and discuss about the 302. So the status code is 302 and status name is found, and it was missing previously. Like previously it was moved temporarily, but now it is found. The description says that the requested resource has been temporarily moved to a new different URL. client should continue to use the original URL for the future request. So it says that previously the resources was moved, but now it is being used, now it is being in work. Okay, so when a client receives 302 status code, it should automatically redirect to the new URL specified in the response, but it should continue to use the original URL for the future request. This means that the redirection is temporary and the client should expect the original URL to become valid again at some point in the future. Okay, so this is about the 302. Now coming to 304, this is like status code is 304, status name is not modified, and in the description we can say that the requested resource has not been modified since the last request, and the server does not need to send a new copy. The client should use its cached copy. Okay, so let's say the client is going to hit one API or trying to hit one URL, okay, and the requested resource has not been modified since the last request. So last time, let's say the client has hit that URL 3 days before, okay, and it is the client is again hitting it today, but the response is not being modified from last 3 days. Okay, so in that case, you can use 304 as a status code. So this is what we are saying here. The requested resource has not been modified since the last request, and the server does not need to send a new copy. The client should use its cached copy. Okay, the status code help to optimize the performance and reduce the unnecessary data transfer between the client and the server, particularly in the scenario where the resource does not change frequently. Okay, so this is where you can use 304. Now coming to the next family of HTTP status code, which is 4xx, which is client error responses. These status code indicate that there was an error in the client request, and the main 4xx family status codes are 400, which is bad request, 401, which is unauthorized, 403, which is forbidden, and 404, which is not found. So I have not mentioned 403 here, but we'll discuss that as well. Now let me try to go to the next slide and discuss about the 400 first. So the status code is 400 and the status is bad request. In the description, we can say that the server cannot process the client request due to the client error, such as malformed syntax or invalid data. So let's say you are going to try to insert one entity in your database through a POST API. So let's say you are going to insert a product in your database through the POST API that you have created, and that product has 4 attributes in its entity like ID, name, price, and the quantity. And when you are going to hit that POST API of that product, which is going to insert that product in your DB, you have to provide the entity, you have to provide the details of that particular products, okay, like ID, name, price, and the quantity. All of the 4 fields you have to provide in the request as a payload. But let's say you are missing any of the parameters, any of the columns, like ID you are missing, or you are missing price. In that case, it will not take your request and it will give you a bad request. That means it will return you the 400 error. Okay, so that is what we are saying here. The server cannot process the client request due to the client error, such as malformed syntax or invalid data. The common reason for encountering a 400 bad request errors includes, these are the following common reasons for encountering the 400, like malformed syntax in the request, such as missing or incorrect headers, invalid HTTP methods, or improper formatted request body, missing required parameter or headers, parameters or the data in the request that does not adhere to the expected format or are outside of the accepted range. So let's say you have set the price of the product or the quantity of the product to some extent. Let's say the quantity you have set to 10 at max, but you are providing 11 as a quantity, so that won't work, okay, because it is outside of the acceptable range. That will give you the 400. Okay, this last one is security restriction or the authentication issue preventing the server from processing the request. So these are the possible scenarios where you will get the 400 HTTP status code. Now let me try to go to the next slide and discuss about the 401, which is unauthorized. So the status code is 401, status is unauthorized. In the description we can say that the request requires user authentication. The client must provide valid credential to access the requested resource. So let's say you have created one API and the client has to provide a valid user ID or the password or the token in order to access that request, in order to access that API. But the client does not provide those things there. The client is not providing the valid user ID, password or token. Then in that case, the client will get 401, which is unauthorized error. Okay, so when a server returns a 401 status code, it often includes a www authentication header in the response specifying the authentication method supported by the server. This header inform the client about the type of authentication required, like basic, digest, bearer. Okay, allowing the client to resend the request with the proper credential. So let's say you have set the bearer, like you are going to hit the API and you are using a token in order to access that API, and you are not setting that token. In that case, you will get 401. Okay, common reason for encountering a 401 unauthorized error includes accessing a protected resource without providing the authentication credential, providing invalid or expired authentication credentials or token, you can say, using incorrect authentication methods or the formats. So these are the possible reason you will get the 401. Now let me try to go to the next slide and discuss about the 403. So this is the status code is 403, status name is forbidden, and let me try to first tell you how this is different from 401. So in the 401, it is unauthorized. You have to provide the valid credentials or valid tokens in order to access that API. But in the case of 403, the user is going to, the client is going to hit that API. In that case, the server knows the person who is hitting the API, but that person does not have the proper access, or you can say the legal access to that particular API. In the case of 401, the server does not know the client who is accessing the API. But in the case of 403, the server knows who is accessing the API, but the person who is accessing the API does not have the legal access to access that API. Okay, so this is about the 403, which is forbidden. In the description, we can say that server understood the client request but refuses to authorize it. Access to the requested resources forbidden. Common reason for encountering a 403 forbidden error includes lack of necessary permission to access the resource, access restriction imposed by the server such as IP address blocking or user agent blocking, authentication credentials provided by the client do not have sufficient privilege to access the resource, access control list or the other security mechanism that explicitly deny access to the certain client or the users. So this is the 403, and we have discussed about the difference between 401 and 403 as well. Now coming to the 404, the status code is 404, name is not found. In the description we can say that the server cannot find the requested resource. It may be temporarily unavailable, moved or deleted. So the client is going to hit one API and that API is not available as of now. In that case, you will get the 404. Common reason for encountering a 404 not found error includes the requested URL does not correspond to any existing resource on the server. Okay, the resources has been moved to a different URL without proper redirection. The resources have been deleted or removed permanently, and the server is unable to process the request due to misconfiguration on the server side. Okay, so this is about the 404. Now let me try to go to the next family of HTTP status code, which is 5xx, which is server error responses. This status code indicates that there was an error on the server side while processing the request. So simply this includes all the errors coming from the server side. Example 500, which is internal server error, 502, which is bad gateway, and 503, which is service unavailable. So let me try to discuss about the 500. So its status code is 500 and the status name is internal server error. In the description, we can say that the server encountered an unexpected condition that prevented it from fulfilling the client request. Common reason for encountering a 500 internal server error includes the bugs or the error in the server-side application, problem with the server configuration, issues with the database or the backend service, overloaded server resource such as CPU or the memory, and temporary disruption or the outage in the network connectivity. So these are the possible reasons when you will get the 500. And now let me try to go to the next slide and discuss about the commonly encountered HTTP status code. So like 404, 401, 500, 200, these are the commonly encountered HTTP status code, you can say, and most of them we have covered. Now let me try to go to the next slide and discuss about the best practices for handling HTTP status codes. So these are the main points that I have listed down here that you should use for handling HTTP status codes. So always handle status code appropriately in your application. Provides meaningful error messages to the users when error occurs. Implement proper redirection when necessary. Monitor and analyze the status code to identify and troubleshoot the issues. So these are the best practices that you can use while handling the HTTP status codes. Now coming to the conclusion, we can say that HTTP status codes are essential for understanding the outcome of a client request. Okay. Familiarity with these codes help in diagnosing and resolving the issue effectively. By adhering to the best practices, developer can ensure a smoother user experience and better system reliability. So this is the conclusion that we can draw from this whole discussion. Now what I will do, I will try to go to the IntelliJ and try to develop one application and then show you where you can use these codes. So let me try to come out of it and try to go to the IntelliJ.